Okay, so now we move on to the subject of the day, disruption. And we're looking at it from the angle of the China-US rivalry and what does that mean for Israel. Navigating disruption is always going to be a challenge. And as much as the US-China competition leads to disruption and change and new alliances, new regional cooperation, certainly the Trump administration is also representing a great deal of disruption. Not only how it's dealing with China, but on a broad sense. And this is really impacting every region individually. Each region is being impacted both by the the China-US rivalry and competition, but also the Trump administration disruption. And then we have the global factor. China is taking new approaches. It's building new styles of alliances. And I think we see for the first time it's working on multilateral relationships. It inaugurated the China, Gulf, Southeast Asia trilateral with the GCC and ASEAN just now. So we want to understand from this esteemed panel, and we're going to bring back our American speaker now. We are very happy to have with us to discuss these issues and the transformations that are taking place, what is happening on the US-China front, and how it's impacting Israel. And our speakers today include our international guests, and I want to note we have 3 international guests this year in the context of the war. That is a great improvement because last year only 1 had the bravery to make it. But now we have from Germany, Marike, Olberg, from India, Ashok, Malik, and 1 from China who you'll meet in...
From Argentina.
But many years in Israel, like me. So we are, I just want to briefly introduce Ashok, who is a partner and chair of the India practice at the Asia Group, formerly of the Ministry of External Affairs of India. Marike is a senior fellow at the Indo-Pacific program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Leo Leiderman is the chief economic advisor of Bank Hapoalim and also a professor at Tel Aviv University. And Doshi, who is zooming in from Washington, is the director of the China Strategy Initiative at the Council on Foreign Relations and formerly of the National Security Council in the US. So, Rush, I'm going to give you the honor of sort of laying the foundations for this conversation, setting the scene of these changes that are taking place due to the US-China competition, and how do you see these changes impacting the global stage, but also from your perspective, Israel?
Sure. Well, thank you. It's great to be with you and look forward to the discussion. I'll just start by saying that right now, it's pretty clear the US-China rivalry is having enormous impact on the global strategic environment. And the primary place, obviously, we're seeing that impact is in the economic domain. So let's talk a little bit about that. The past panel mentioned briefly the reality that the US and China are pursuing some form of decoupling, or previously what was called derisking. I think this is something that both countries are thinking about. The US wants to bring back manufacturing or diversify it outside the United States, and China for over a decade has been thinking about indigenizing its supply chains, making the world more dependent on China, and China less dependent on the world, and that dual circulation policy that China has is a pretty good example of that. That's the first point. The second point is that has led us to this trade war in large part. China's surplus with the world is unsustainable, particularly the United States. It is 30% of global manufacturing, but only 17% of global consumption. And right now, what that's meant is the US wants to rebalance the terms of trade. Now, the trade war has reached a temporary ceasefire, if you will. With both sides meeting in Geneva, there was a effort to kind of reduce the tariff rates. And many people took, some good feelings from that meeting. But the reality is, and this brings me to a third point, the trade war is not over. Geneva may have happened, tariffs may have come down, but as we just saw in the last 24 hours, much more is still happening. And this is becoming not a trade war, but an export control war, essentially. China continues to throttle supplies of rare earths and rare earth magnets to the United States, which has significant impacts on industrial production in America. And meanwhile, the US is exerting pressure now on semiconductor design technology, design tools, preventing them from being used by China and potentially threatening to kick out hundreds of thousands of Chinese students in the United States. So we're seeing continued escalation, which means that trade deal is not quite going to hold, potentially down the road. The next frontier, this is my fourth and final point, could be financial escalation. We've seen the trade war, we've seen export control tit for tat. What comes next could be some kind of financial escalation where both sides, China perhaps playing with its stocks of US treasuries, the US perhaps going after Chinese banks, all that creates further escalation. I'll end with this. A lot of countries are caught in the middle. They're caught in the middle because the US is renegotiating trade agreements with those countries and is trying to find out what role they will have with China. And what will their trade arrangement with China be? Will there be hubs for transshipment? So there's an element where the US is trying to exert some degree of influence over the China-related trade policies of other countries. And the second way countries are caught in the middle is that supply chains are being disrupted, and often that impacts them directly. So a moment of great transformation, great transition, the greatest international economic disruptions since the 1970s, and we don't yet know how it's all going to end.
Thank you, Resh. I think that being caught in the middle has a different meaning for different countries, in part perhaps because of their size, and in part because of how they have played their global economic ties and relations over the past few decades. So, Marike, I'm going to turn to you, who you have the perspective of German and also deep understanding of China. So, do you think Germany's caught in the middle, and how do you see the China-U.S. rivalry impacting your area, and also if you could give an opinion on what you think it might mean for us?
Sure. So, obviously Germany is impacted. Germany has always been impacted by the US-China rivalry, even though we have, I think, in Europe for the longest tried to pretend that geopolitics doesn't exist. Germany was basically in this arrangement where it had security provided by the United States, while it could economically deepen its ties with China. Our automotive industry, which is a big part of the German economy, is heavily reliant on China, which has for the longest time shaped German China policy, which sometimes has had impact on not just German China policy, but European China policy. Now, for the past couple of years, we've already seen a little bit of change. It's not entirely new to us that maybe we can't continue like this. So over the last couple of years, Germany has already, there's been some progress in figuring out that maybe we can no longer do this. We're going to have to de-risk our relationship with China. We're not going to need to make sure that, because if push comes to shove and we're going to have to pick sides, we're going to have to most likely side with the United States. That was, obviously the the understanding, and still is. So we are heavily affected. I do think there is a great deal of uncertainty right now in Germany what to do. I think people did prepare for the Trump administration, but they didn't prepare enough. And I think the scenario that I've seen has kind of exceeded people's expectations of what they thought. I think people were prepping for a Trump 1+ scenario. So a little bit like the first Trump administration, but a little more. So right now there is a lot of rethinking. How are we going to deal with this? What we're also seeing is a lot of outreach from China towards Europe, towards Germany in particular, to, we have a common opponent in the United States. The United States is pressuring both us and Europe from the Chinese perspective on trade. So why don't we work together? It's also my understanding that there's a lot of concern in the US about this, whether Europe is going to turn towards China. In all of this, I think the reason why we won't is China doesn't have a lot of substance to offer to Europe. Europe has very specific things it wants from China. It wants China to reform its economic model in a way that overcapacities no longer flood the European market. That is something that China won't do, because it means having to revamp the entire Chinese economic system. And the other thing it wants from China is stop supporting Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. That is something where perhaps we can achieve something if we're willing to link up issues and start pushing for our interests more vigorously. But also, I'm not too optimistic that we will get any concessions. So to come to a close, what Europe needs to do, what Germany needs to do, and also what Israel needs to do is figure out, okay, what are our interests, our core interests, our interests vis-a-vis China? What is China willing to give us? Perhaps how can we link up with others who are in a similar situation, and how can we push the hardest possible to actually assert our interests vis-a-vis China and sometimes vis-a-vis the United States, depending on which position we're in. And that really is the best strategy. And that's something that at least in Europe we're struggling with. I'm not as familiar with the context here in Israel, but I do think there is possibly also a certain reluctance to push for certain things vis-a-vis China, but that ultimately is something that we're going to have to do.
So it's a high stakes game where we're talking about economy. I think you were referencing the car industry is huge. Germany is very dependent on the car industry and its car industry within China, which is diminishing in relevance for the Chinese and becoming probably a growing problem for Germany. But the definition of being caught in the middle when you are 1.4 billion people is very different. And that is India. India is not caught in the middle. So how do you see if you're not caught in the middle, what is the status of India with respect to this rivalry? How is it impacting you? And what do you see as the path forward?
Oh, we are not caught in the middle. We are the middle. Okay. Thank you for having me here, Carice and Signal. 3 points. One, when we talk about the US-China rivalry, derisking, decoupling, I'd like to distinguish a long-term trend line with what I would call the Trump acceleration, which is a somewhat sort of up and down acceleration. We don't know where it'll settle, but there is a long-term trend line which is different from the Trump acceleration, which preceded Trump, perhaps was set in pace by Trump 1, continued by Biden, and will continue in 28 or 29, irrespective of who becomes president. What Trump has done is he's brought his own sort of disruption to that trend line. Biden and Jake Sullivan defined the economic decoupling as small yard, high fence. Trump has decided he wants a much larger yard. Whether that large yard is feasible and bringing back all of that manufacturing that he wants to bring back to the US is feasible or even worthwhile is very, very unclear. I would think there's a rethink needed somewhere at some point, but that's besides the point. But that is where we are. Having said that, the essential argument successive American presidents, including Trump, have had with the sourcing of supply chains and concentration of supply chains and sourcing in certain geographies in China and regions around China is an argument many other countries have also had. India's also had that. And if supply chains begin to decongest, if sourcing begins to become a little more equitable, some of that will benefit India. It will not benefit only India. It will benefit many other countries, but it will benefit India as well. And we will certainly welcome that. Okay. Second, you're talking about how countries are choosing between the US and China. I think there are two very interesting trends here. One, the space for hedging between the US and China is narrowing, is contracting. However, for countries that are broadly aligned with America or more pro-America, the propensity to hedge with other countries in that subsphere vis-a-vis America is growing. So you want to work with America, but you also want diverse partners. To turn a Reagan aphorism around, you want to trust but diversify, which is what India is doing by doing stuff with Australia and now New Zealand in a trilateral, which is what India is doing with Japan and South Korea in a technology partnership that was blessed by America, but now is independent of America in some respects, though it wants to work with America. This is what India is doing in signing an FTA with the UK or negotiating an early harvest agreement with the EU. And the EU is also more interested post-Trump in doing this with India. These are all small wins. None of them replaces the large win that would be a greater American presence, but it is where we are. In essence, America is no longer the 800-pound gorilla in the room. It is the 700-pound gorilla in the room. The point is, for each of us, including Israel, how do we fill the remaining 100 pounds? We can't fill it with just one actor or one relationship. We need to fill it with multiple relationships, each of which add some weight to that missing 100 pounds. And those multiple partnerships, those multiple arrangements, those several plurilaterals and minilaterals will stretch across the security and economic continuum. And I would imagine Israel would also want to go down that route.
So let's find out. Leo, being caught in the middle versus or at the same time, following Ashok's theory of this being a motivating factor to diversify relationships and establish new bilateral but also minilateral relationships. How does this sit with Israel in the U.S.-China rivalry?
Okay, thanks, and thanks, Carice, and your whole group for this impressive conference and for inviting me to take place on it. First of all, on China, U.S., China, I'm not optimistic. I think that we are going to see fluctuations in the sentiment. And right now, of course, as we know, Donald Trump has sort of created a pause until July 9th, or the second week of July, both vis-a-vis the European Union and vis-a-vis China. If someone wants to believe that on July 10th or July 15th, we will say, well, we now have a new set of parameters of trading between nations. These are the tariff rates between the US and Mexico. Forget about it. Because I think by the mere nature of Trump, his unpredictability and his changing mood and zigzags in the policies based on an hourly sentiment, we are going to see a lot of variability and turbulence from that point of view. So I think from this point of view, we have all to prepare for all his term. I hope this will be the last term of Donald Trump. And as an economist, I can say that it is a very unfortunate accident that has happened to the global economy, because the notion of trade wars and the notion of deglobalization and the whole narrative of Mr. Trump that it is the competition with China and Europe has produced less and less jobs in the United States is completely false, and there is a lot of research and evidence about that. And basically, when Trump gets to the White House on January 20th, the United States is in full employment. There is no problem of employment in the United States. And the United States is growing very nicely. And the United States is the #1 country that has benefited from importing cheap raw materials, cheap intermediate goods and final goods from the rest of the world. Anyway, so that's my first point. On the issue of Israel, first point is that we have to put it on the table. Israel is in a state of a very unfortunate war. And it is my hope, as a citizen of this country, as an economist and so on, that this war will end for the benefit of everybody in the region as soon as possible, with all the refugees and all our people there coming back here. Now, clearly, a lot of the discussion that we can have about these very important topics will depend on how Israel ends the war. So if Israel becomes more isolated and vis-a-vis Europe, vis-a-vis China, and so on and so forth, maybe there will be some rivalry with the US. We heard yesterday about some conversations that were very tough between Donald Trump and Mr. Netanyahu about the possibility of attacking Iran and so on and so forth. So parameter number one is how Israel is going to end this war, and I hope it happens sooner rather than later. The second point I'd like to make is thinking more positively about the potential. Yes, we are in the middle. And for a small open economy like Israel, the trade in goods, services, and finance with China is very important. It is very important for us with Europe, that is our main trading partner. It is very important for us with the United States. What is Israel's comparative advantage? Israel's comparative advantage is in advanced technologies. This is what we can offer the world. And I think that from this point of view, if the conditions at the end of the war are good enough, then we should focus on those areas where there will be demand, where we can serve the interests of the United States, Europe, and China in terms of technology. We know from the past that if there is one sort of dangerous and risky area for Israel to involve in the area of technology vis-a-vis the US, vis-a-vis China, is the combination of defense, intelligence, and technology. So I think, and I'm very much in touch with the startup nation in Israel, and some of my former students and colleagues are involved in startups and so on and so forth. As long as we focus in Israel on comparative advantage that can serve the medical industry, producing a new medicine for a given problem, developing some computer devices for education, and so on. Nothing that gets near issues like intelligence, defense, the army, the military. I think this would be the most advised area to follow. And to end, if I really want to be sort of optimistic and positive, I think that if we will have a new Middle East, Israel will have a lot to offer to the countries in the region, again, in terms of technology, in terms of building infrastructure for services, not only for industry, and including, of course, Saudi Arabia. And I believe it will be in the interest of the United States and in the interest of China the morning after, right? That with such a potential contribution of Israel knowledge and know-how to the region, and we have the Abraham Accords, of course, and we can solidify that. And any sort of, although it is an indirect effect, but any strength that we can offer to contribute to this region to become more stable and more growing one, I think will be in the benefit of everyone.
Okay, so Rush, what do you see from the other side of the Atlantic regarding the potential for minilateral relationships that are not necessarily involving the US or China in order to navigate this complex new trajectory of international relations? And looking at the middle powers in our region, we know that countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, even Israel, they have a global reach in what they offer and what they are involved in. So how do does the U.S. and how do you see the potential for those kinds of relationships developing as a result of this competition?
Well, it's a fair question. And in the Biden administration, there was great support for many laterals, sometimes with the US, but as was referenced earlier, just as often without the US. The joke was that within Asia, the US had a hub and spokes model, a US hub and allied spokes. And what was beneficial for the region was for there to be a tire around the spokes. In other words, for them to connect to each other without necessarily touching the hub. So there's still value in that, but let me break down your question in two dimensions. The first is security, and the second is economics and technology. In the security space, there's a lot that can be done within minilaterals. Just take India and Israel right now. A lot of India's most advanced technology, including what was just recently used in the conflict with Pakistan, has Israeli components. And of course, we all know that there's a lot of ways in which European militaries, with their production of certain precision-guided munitions, Southeast Asians have demand for those. The Indians want submarines. Maybe the French can help. The Koreans want to sell more to Europe and to the Middle East. Everybody is seeing an opportunity in the security space for unusual linkages that allow countries to play roles with each other that previously were not standard or even fathomable without the U.S. being a directly involved. So on security, there's a lot of opportunity on the minilateral side. Now let's move to economics and trade. I'm less optimistic that minilaterals will be successful in economic and trade matters, particularly when it comes to technology. And the reason why is the simple reality is the structure of the global economy is such that the U.S. is ultimately the demand sink for most of the world. The U.S. market is where, when China manufactures or Southeast Asia manufactures, it ends up here. So one way or another, because of the dollar's role as a reserve currency, the U.S. has the kind of reciprocal quality of being the ultimate source of demand for the world economy. Can that be replaced? Can it be replaced if Asia consumes more? Maybe. Can it be replaced if Latin America or Africa consumes more? Maybe. But the reality is none of them will be able to consume enough to sustain the production that they have. And it's difficult for minilaterals to work when all the countries involved are essentially creditor countries, or they're countries with major trade surpluses. And that's the situation we find ourselves in now. So it's good that countries are making these arrangements, but I think we should be realistic about how much they'll be able to compensate for any diminishment in U.S. demand. Which brings me to a final set of points. What will a deal look like between the U.S. and its allies? What is the ideal shape of that deal? If you listen to President Trump and some on his team, all they care about is bilateral trade deficits. But we know that there's more to the story than bilateral trade deficits. We know, for example, that many of the countries that are implicated in these trade deals also have technology to offer. They have investment they can provide to the United States, and they have things they need from the United States, including greater access to sophisticated weaponry. So you could imagine 4 points in any kind of deal, whether it's with Israel or with other countries around the world. And some countries will have different parts of this that they'll do better. But one is that we essentially drop tariffs between these countries, between the U.S. and the country it's trying to do a deal with. We'll keep them at a low level. There might still be non-tariff barriers, but the low tariff rate produces a lot of good. The second possibility is that you could have investment from other countries into the United States. That's more relevant for Japan or Korea, which have key manufacturing capabilities the U.S. now lacks. The third component is some degree of security cooperation, which looks like the U.S. providing more technology forward, but those countries providing perhaps more willingness to take up certain burdens. This may be less relevant in the Middle East, but maybe more relevant in Asia. And the final component would be the moat. Essentially, countries around the world putting up some kind of barriers to China's sheer capacity. And I'll end with one final fact. China is right now about 30% of global manufacturing. In 5 to 6 years, it'll be 40% of global manufacturing. That's not leaving a lot of space for other countries that want to be involved in manufacturing. And so there needs to be some way collectively of handling that enormous capacity so that our industries can survive. And that'll look like, I think, quiet agreements to restrict the flow of certain Chinese goods into third markets. And the goal is not to decouple. It's not necessarily to de-risk. It's to create breathing room for other industries to create scale so they can be successful. And of course, there's a lot more to the global economy than software. Manufacturing does count. And that's where this will be the most relevant. So let me stop there.
Well, that covered quite a lot of ground, and I would say that certainly we in Israel don't believe there's a replacement for the U.S. on many levels, but I think globally, no, I don't think even China thinks there's a replacement for the United States. It's got its own unique contributions, but at the same time, perhaps we can have more opportunity created, not only for security interaction, but Marike, also in the area of working together. I mean, IMEC was discussed quite a bit, and I don't want to continue that discussion here, but that is one example of where trade is moving between the East and West, and also probably bringing in the North-South. Which does not necessarily include either the US or China. So do you see that's a possibility, opportunity resulting from these developments?
I think one opportunity that we have beyond the resulting from these developments is, and that's both an opportunity and a challenge, is the need to rethink a lot of things very fundamentally, and to act and to take action that we have long not wanted to take. And again, I can go back to Europe, where we've been talking about a lot of actions that are needed to be done in Europe's interests, and a lot of those are related to China. To start pushing back more forcefully against China, and there's always barriers against that and arguments against that. And under the current circumstances, if things go well, we will be forced to do it because we won't have any other options. And that, of course, is a massive challenge, but it can also be an opportunity. And I think a similar principle works in other areas where countries that have long had, interests in common, but there are certain barriers against it, or it's not a priority number one, are now doing things because you have to rethink quite fundamentally, and you have to look, where are your interests and what are you able to do? And some initiatives are gonna get a push from that, I believe. And that is not per se a bad thing. Now, again, I'm not actually a glass half full person on this. I do see a lot of challenges, but it is forcing us to rethink. And it will prompt new developments, and that in general is good.
Ashok, you have a long history relationship with Israel, and you come from a strong business background in your current position. What is your perception of how Israel should position itself in this rivalry, and what their opportunities might be regarding new relationships and minilaterals where India has a growing good relationship with Israel?
First, I'd like to go back to something Rush said about no country or combination of countries replacing the demand sink that the US is. I would say it's more than that. I completely agree with him there. I would say the US, with all the Trumpian disruption, with all the problems we're facing, with all the domestic challenges and internal wrestling in the US, remains an irreplaceable power. If you're talking about even something like IMEC, yes, the US is extra-regional to IMEC. It's not part of Europe or the Middle East or South Asia or the subcontinent. But quite honestly, without a significant buy-in by the US and a push by the US, IMEC will never reach fruition. It will, the many parts of IMEC will continue doing business with each other, but the whole will never quite happen without a larger strategic buy-in which has US backing. So I'm pretty clear about that. We are all looking at not an absent US, because that would be catastrophic for everybody. We are looking at a less present US, perhaps, for its own reasons. In this entire process, all of us are looking at different arrangements, different partnerships that allow us to fill some of the gaps that the US is leaving behind. Whether in security, whether in terms of a market, we need to find new markets for our products, our goods, our services much more aggressively, even though the collective weight of all of those markets might not equal what we've lost in the US. every country is struggling with this, which is why every country, despite the exasperation with the volatile tariff movements in Trump's America, wants a tariff or trade deal with America. Every single country, including India, is holding its nose and saying, let's do that deal. So America remains very, very important and in many ways irreplaceable. But what Israel can do, what India is doing, look around you. Look at how countries are trying to find alternatives in some way or the other. The best example is the sixth generation fighter project put together by Japan, Italy, and the UK. I know of at least 3 Asian countries outside Japan that are looking to sign up and are negotiating. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, at least 2 of those countries, and perhaps even Italy itself would have considered working much more closely with America. But people are looking for alternatives. People are looking to hedge. And that is where the opportunity lies, even for America's steadfast friends, such as Israel and I would say India.
Leo, what do you think of this, Ashok's perspective on that? Where do you see Israel's potential and opportunities as far as new relationships?
Yeah, I fully agree with Ashok's overview and vision about how things are moving. I would, as a macroeconomist, I would like to point out that of course, we are going to see a declining U.S. economy, and the risk of recession is there. And the number one country that is going to suffer from trade war is the United States. And I think there is pretty much a consensus in Wall Street that the forecast is one of stagflation, so some kind of stagnation. I'm not sure that there will be a deep recession or even a recession, but clearly a slowdown in the growth of the US economy coupled with some rise in inflation. That is bad news for the United States. It is bad news for the whole world. So the first effect I think we have to consider is a scaling down of international trade, of the volume, because even if the United States moves apart, there is not a one-to-one substitution via the entry of Europe or China. And again, it has been said, the United States is the most powerful and richest economy in the world, and we are talking about a transition that may take many, many years. So we have all to be prepared to this scaling down that means that the world economic activity will be much below the potential growth in the next few years. In terms of the diversification factor, yes, I think that there are new opportunities, and Marike has also indicated that. Let me give another example in addition to the one given by Ashok. Having been born in Argentina and as someone that follows a lot Latin America and emerging markets, I can tell you that the trade links between China and Mexico, China and Brazil, China and Argentina are going up exponentially. So, 2-3 years from now, many US companies are going to find out that there is no demand for their products because China is there. And Latin America, as you know, is a major exporter of commodities, for example, agricultural commodities, food, things that China and some of the Asian countries are in very high demand. So that there is a very mutual trade over there to be taken. And I'm also, I don't know about your views, but definitely the intensity of the trade between Europe and China is immense. There is they are very, very important trading partners. And therefore, I think that, once again, it's not the end of the world, but clearly, let us hope that some of this is a transitory phenomenon. We don't know what's going to happen. But in terms of the Trump reactions to the evolution of the United States economy, because one scenario that worries me is that if the slowdown in the U.S. economy is very strong, Trump may be even taking a more extreme view on tariffs, because in his narrative, and it is not a new narrative, it is a narrative of 3 or 4 decades. People don't know that. He has been publishing articles in the New Wall Street Journal and advertisements about how international trade is damaging the US economy for decades. So this is something that is very embedded in his belief. And he may think that, well, that more tariffs are needed in order to induce more growth in the United States economy. And that may be worrisome. But yes, this is a time of transition. This is a time of finding new opportunities. And we know that when everything is moving, yes, there are those countries and companies and entities that are going to find the windows of opportunity.
So not the end of the world, but maybe the end of the world as we know it. And I'm going to ask for final remarks from each. But first, Ashok, you wanted to respond.
I'll make that my final set of remarks as well. With due respects, Professor, the current globalization and trade model has more challenges than just the US and just Trump. It is far from being an unmixed blessing.
But the way, if you allow me,
yes,
the way to resolve the issues is to sit around the table.
I don't think the other party wants to sit around the table, with due respects. Again, not going into politics in America right now, but I'm not sure China was willing to sit around the table. Second, perhaps because of your geographical location, perhaps because you've had enormous stresses in your near neighborhood, almost existential stresses and crises. I completely appreciate that as a friend of Israel. You haven't had to confront realism about a lot of questions related to China that other countries are confronting. One day you'll have to. I'll just stop there.
Okay. Rush, can you please share your final thoughts in a minute?
In a minute, sure. I agree with everything Ashok just said. I think it's exactly right. The international trading system is profoundly imbalanced. There is a China element at the heart of that, including, again, the fact that they are more than 30% of global production and less than 17% of global consumption. A delta sustainable when they had a smaller economy, but unsustainable as their economy achieves the status it has today. That does force questions in the economic and tech space for everybody, including Israel. The bigger point, I think, is as these trade deals are resolved, a critical question for all countries will be what the US asks from those countries on China. And that question now, having been of the mantra that we should not force countries to choose, that question is now being called. And countries increasingly will have to make choices about the structure of their domestic economies that will be, in some cases, painful, in other cases, quite lucrative, depending on how which industries you look at. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And my mic is off. That's done. Marike. Oh, Marike, please.
Very brief, three quick points in response to some of our discussion. Once, I keep hearing 2028. I'm slightly less optimistic that the United States is going to make a 180-degree turnaround again. I do think what we're currently seeing from America is based on structural factors that are not going away. So whether or not, whatever happens in 2028, we'll be contending with what we're dealing with right now for a long time to come. I'm not expecting a full return. Second, I want to second the China challenge is real. It's very real for Europe. It's very much, we do have a problem with our industry because it's very, very real. And it's something that Europe has had to deal with for a very long time by pushing back harder. And therefore, third point, I do hope that the current situation is going to force us to do just that because we have no other option. And again, even though I'm not a glass half full person, I'll end on this optimistic note. I really hope it's going to push a lot of countries to grow up and do the things that have been necessary to do for a really long time.
Necessity is the mother of invention. So I want to thank all of our panelists in the US, from Israel, from Germany, from India. Thank you so much, everyone. It was outstanding. Thank you.